We're not very good communicators because we've never really been taught how to communicate, and we're not good at what's termed a coherent, contingent conversation. And a coherent, contingent conversation is one where you're totally present for the other person. So you're present in mind, you're present in body, you're attuned to what they're saying rather than what we mostly do is work out what we're going to respond with. And if you're working out what you're going to respond with, you can't actually be attending. The brain doesn't do that. The brain can't actually multitask. It's a nonsense. It's a myth. That the brain has to shut off one section and open up another section. It does it very, very quickly, but it operates like a computer. A computer can't run two things at once. Okay, so it's always a fast shutdown, process. So a coherent contingent, so it's contingent on what the person is saying. It's coherent because you're actually working with what they're saying and you've got your agenda out of the way, etc., etc., etc. Instead of doing that, what we do is that we just go into automatic pilot and we just work out a response. And as soon as we get a social cue, which is anything from a blink of the eye or a pause, we're in there with our opinion and our stuff like that, which actually doesn't get anywhere. Now, if you think about what an argument is, well, yeah, and when I say, I used to, have 200 odd people in front of me during these large seminars, and I would say, look, if this person has a model of the world, and it just happens to be, different to this person's model of the world, which one's correct? Which one's right?
May not be right.
Well, mostly people would say both, and that's fine. And then you say, well, what happens if that person had 100 people with a different model of the world? Which one's right now? What happens if that person has 1,000,000 people with a completely different model of the world? Which one's right? And basically people will say they're both right. And then I would ask people, well, have you ever had an argument? Well, if you both can be right, what were you arguing about? In fact, you can't be both right. Because in order for your right to exist, it must exist in the face of its opposite, which is wrong. So in order for you to be right, you have to make the other side of your argument wrong. I mean, that's what, the gang of three, Plato, Aristotle and Socrates, they developed, logical argument, the lawyers speak. You have to make the other side wrong in order for your right to exist, and it can't exist in a vacuum. It has to exist opposite something, and what it's opposite is generally it's wrong. So for you to win, you've got to do all the point scoring. Now that's how we think, it's called the Aristotelian methodology of thought. That's how we're brought up. And so we're brought up on argument, we're brought up on debate. We're not brought up on creativity. We're not brought up on exploration.
Compromise.
Sorry?
Or compromise.
Well, compromise is right-wrong. Compromise is the right-wrong system because you're just compromising.
So how can you achieve perhaps a discussion whereby you can make a decision where you've got two people wanting to achieve something different?
And so if you've got two people wanting to achieve something different, you're going to have either, and it takes two to have the conversation. You can't have a one-way conversation. But in order for you to understand the other person, how many terms do we have that say, in order to understand the other person, you walk a mile in their shoes, or something of that nature? So, the first thing that you've got to try and understand is where the other person is coming from. So we use language, but you have no idea what the word means to me, and I have no idea what the words mean for you, but we nod in agreement as though the word means exactly the same to both. So if I say the colour yellow, you're going to nod, yes, I know what yellow is, but you have no idea what I mean by yellow.
Mm-hmm. I hear what you're saying, but how can you...
Now, well, I've got to find out what you mean by yellow.
Okay.
Now, how do I find what you mean by yellow? I now have to ask questions. I now have to inquire. So that means I've got to be able to get my definition of yellow out of the way. I've got to get my agenda of being right out of the way, and I want to force you to accept my definition of yellow. So, if you think about, okay, how do I get inside your model of the world in order to understand better for myself, so that I can make more effective decisions in relationship to what I'm hearing, rather than I'm just trying to get my way. So one of the questions that you might use is, okay, so in any given context, it doesn't matter what it is. Would you like to go to the beach? Would you like, toast or bread or whatever? You can just say, well, what's important to you about? And then you just fill in whatever the context is. So what's important to you about your business relationship with me? And so you might be speaking to a vendor. A client. Yeah, okay. So what's important to you about your relationship with me? No, but now the vendor is going to actually give me, well, what is important to them, and now I'm going to either say, well, yes, I can supply that, or not on your nelly. But if I don't ask that, I'm assuming that I already know it.
But how many people would be open and honest about what they really want?
Sorry?
Yeah.
So I'm giving you a model to go into somebody's mind, and you're coming up with a barrier. You're coming up with a yeah, but. Because the first words out of your mouth were a yeah, but. That means that you haven't actually understood what I've been saying. You haven't been attuned to what I've been saying. Because the yeah, but is not the correct response. A more efficient response would be something like, oh, Paul, I haven't thought about that before. Let me just think about it. Let me mull it over for a while and I'll see. And so, but you went straight into a reaction. Yeah, but. No, it's just an automatic response.
Yeah.
It's just an automatic response because that's the way that we've been trained and conditioned.
Okay.
And unless we pick...
recognise that straight away in me.
Just... if I start pointing it out, I'd be doing it for half the night. Now, just understand what took place. So here I am, I'm exchanging some information.
Yes.
And you're nodding and you're giving me the social cues. But the language pattern you come back with is a yeah, but. Now, what does but mean in this context?
Well, you just said
Yeah.
I wasn't listening.
I disagree. So the word itself means I disagree.
That's what he was saying. That while he's talking, we're actually thinking about what we're going to say to him. Rather than instead of listening and hearing what it is saying.
So the better response was, let me hear that again, please.
Well, any response would be a better one.
No, you're really throwing me under the bus.
But if you think about, well, okay, what message would I receive? What message would you like to receive that is enabling you to understand that you are being heard, that you are being listened to? What sorts of things would come back the other way that allows you to say, gee, they're really paying attention to me. They're listening.
Question based on what you said.
That would be one way. A question based on what you said. That would be seeking either clarification or expansion. What other ways could we do it?
Rephrasing what you said.
A rephrase of what you said. Now let me see if I've got you right. What I think I heard you say is... Kirsten's going to shout down the pub. No, sorry.
Which I actually experimented with.
Another way of doing it would be to say, hey, look, I haven't actually thought about it that way before. And so that's now giving me the social cue that, yeah, look, something's going on. Something's being digested. Something's being, getting through.
And I have experimented with that in particular where you ask, let me get, am I on the right track, or like, let me rephrase this, and with my daughter once, only for her to jump on me in mid-sentence and to say, will you stop analysing and just basically get to the point? Because I'm not with my therapist right now, you know.
Yeah.
And it drives her batty.
and again, it takes a lot of practice and it takes a lot of skill.
Right.
Effective communication is a learned art. Ineffective communication is simply an enculturated process, which is why we don't often function at the highest common denominator. What we end up doing is functioning at the lowest common denominator. So it'll be the lowest common denominator between us. And so if I just point out your language patterns from last week. So last week when you were talking about a book and I was giving you a few ideas to go on with, what came back was a whole series of resistance-based statements. Oh, but, what about this, what about this? Well, look, we haven't even got to that territory yet. We're just exploring an idea. So we're still in the creative phase where you went into editorial phase or editing phase. You know, it's like the writer. They type 4 words and they pull it out and rip it out. They type another 4 words and they put it out and screw it up. You know, what we're trying to do is create, but they're going into editing at the same time. Never, ever, ever works.